Hello, good morning, everyone. We're picking back up here in 1 Samuel 17. And when we left off together yesterday, we uh, saw David and, in this context of just having shown up with goods from his father for his brothers, and just, looking at the disdain as well that was given to him, by his brothers. Why are you here? Questioning his heart, questioning his motives. And then we also got to see his focus as well. His focus among his brothers and even among the army, as he found out, this prize that was to be given, to he that would to the person who would go out and battle successfully Goliath. And it seemed almost as a just a coincidence. He just happened to be there going about his business, and had heard this giant with words of disdain, defiling his God, and he wouldn't stand for it. And then on top of this, there was this prize. People gave him the information about the prize, and he sets off. And we'd finish up in verse 37, where David was sharing all of the things, finalizing his sharing of all the things that he had dealt with as a shepherd, guarding the sheep. And verse 37, we ended with, "Moreover, David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he, once again, disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." I blown away, just blown away by the confidence here and the simplicity of it, and um, there's so much reflection that can be had right here in these verses. One, from the perspective of Goliath. Here's this giant, looking, going, "Man, is this it?" 40 days, we had read in earlier verses that this giant Goliath had been out in this valley challenging, "Hey, bring me a man so that I can fight," and just waiting. And now here comes David, uh, just as a young guy, simply with sticks, and he had even asked David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Like, are you for real? Is this serious? And I'm certain that, from his perspective, he's thinking, "Man, I'm about to just absolutely 100% clobber this guy." And then right after that, we see David's confidence, and his confidence is not in himself. He doesn't even bring up, what he has in his hand. He doesn't, he doesn't, he doesn't, give a resume of another resume here of his time in the field, and how, lions and bears. It's very simple. He says, "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And he even tells him what he's going to do. "I'm going to strike you, and I'm going to take your head from you." Also, back in verse 38, it says, when Saul clothed David with his armor. That's significant. And there's some significance in that, with the fact that during this time period, the positions of authority were always marked with formal insignia or by special clothing. So with Saul literally giving over his armor, his helmet, and clothing him with his coat of mail, there's this giving, so from a perspective, I mean, this, the kingdom being giving over of sorts. Yet what's beautiful here, even though that's the case, David, one, hadn't tested them, and two, he was depending on God, all, and rather than being uh, uh, slowed down, if you will, by untested by untested gear. Um, he's going out just as a shepherd boy with his pouch and his and his 5 stones and his sling. And too, just thinking about the in depending on God, God's plan unravels as He plans, and it's continuing to do so now. So everything that we've read up to this point, is this pointing to, is this unfolding of God revealing Himself through the Scriptures and pointing to the kingdom to come, right? Pointing to His kingdom, and this constant pointing to, and even here, it's in simplicity that David goes forth, um, and even defies our own logic. How many of us would want to go out just armed to the bear? I know I would. My initial impulse would be, man, uh, give me everything that I can possibly have. Oh, and by the way, will you guys please back me up? That I may have the confidence and the just the dependence on God. To go forth. As David does here. It's just a beautiful picture of God once again delivering His people, um, that defies logic, and we've seen it. We've seen it through the Red Sea. We've seen it multiple times, and even here as David takes down Goliath. Verse 48, so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took a sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley into the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, Inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Um, at first glance here, how could the with Saul's questioning of who is uh, his question is of whose son is this youth? It almost appears like he doesn't know who he is. But if you really look at the question, whose son is he? It's because uh, earlier we had seen that David was ministering to Saul already with harp, in the courts of the king, and ministering him. So how could he be inquiring of this? And it's not who is he? I mean, he knows who David is, but I mean, boy, David just slew Goliath. There's a prize at stake as well, right? I mean, because if we remember the prize that was set forth back in let's see here. The prize will enrich with great riches, back in verse 25. Whoever kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So now it's time to find out. Hey, whose son is this youth? And that's now we no kidding need to know who his family is, because this guy just won the prize. And then David answers, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Chapter 18. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house any more. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. David does accept this. Back just a moment ago, as we were talking about this insignia and this transfer of gear, if you will, that had a level of importance, and that does take place here. David does accept what Jonathan is giving him. His robe, his armor, his sword, and his bow and his belt, and there's an essence here of this is being transferred. Jonathan as son of the king. Now this is being transferred to David. But in a beautiful way as well. It says, Jonathan loved him as his own soul, it says. And then this covenant that was made between them. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And we're going to see this behaved wisely keep showing up. And we'll speak to it later, but just note that, behaved wisely. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it had happened, as they were coming home and David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced, yet now their song is a little different. And this is what they said: Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now, what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. He eyed him, right? What's going on with this guy? We've spoken of this before. It's God who raises up, and it's God who puts down. What is that transition like if we find ourselves right in that transition? What if we've been risen up by God, and now what if we're in a time period of our life where we're being taken down, and there's somebody else that's to step in and come into this area of position of authority, right? The very king of a kingdom. Too bad Saul couldn't see it as God's work. Couldn't see it as God being at work here. We've already seen Saul take things into his own hands, and now he's eyeing David. I'm sure there's jealousy, this envy of, hey, what's going on? This is mine, of even, territory, right? This is mine, and here comes David. And why is it that they sing? They're only ascribing thousands to me, but 10,000s to him. Already this is happening. So if you find yourself there, may God be with you. May you be in prayer. May you just seek God's counsel, and don't fear man. It's God. It's God at work. It's His Spirit at work, moving through the situation. And just be in prayer of that. I don't know who that's for, but that just seems to keep coming up. Heck, maybe it's even for me. Verse 10, and it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. So seeing this come to fruition, this jealousy, this eyeing of David. This distressing spirit is upon Saul. David's in his court, playing the music, ministering to Saul, and then Saul is just so eaten up with it that he tries to impale David with his spear. Yet it says David escaped his presence twice. Okay, guys, 10 seconds left. God bless you. May your day be fruitful. See you next time.